Aaron. And in reading through those some of those scriptures, it's going to be interesting to work through them this morning. And when I was going through that this past week, there's one thought that sort of came to my head is it's funny what some people will notice sometimes and what some people will not notice. And just as in way of an example or to clarify what I mean by that, like take for example, well, this. A few weeks ago, a week and a half ago, we had a piano tuner come in here to tune the piano, and he's been in here before, Jason Dick. He's a good guy, he seems to know his stuff pretty well, and as he's unpacking his tools, I'm standing there just waiting for him to notice something. I'm waiting for him to notice the flooring, right? So I'm just kind of there, then he looks at me, and so I have to say to him, well, do you notice anything different in here? And he's looking around, and and then he's desperately trying to find something, because he's a piano tuner who's very detail-oriented, right? And so he's trying to figure it out, and then I said, the flooring's different. And he says, oh, yeah. And now, in fairness to him, he's only here when he's tuning the piano or tweaking it or something along that line. So can't really be too difficult on him. And really, you know what? If it's not Jason, it's me. There's things I don't notice either. Like lots of things that I don't notice that I'm oblivious to. For example, there's 2 new tablecloths at the back. Did anyone notice the new tablecloth? Yeah, well, look at that. Some people put their hand up right away. Every male didn't put their hand up, but anyway, Mike is standing. Yeah, he's going to check them out right now. And but I didn't notice, and when Marianne asked me that question, and I said, I didn't even notice, and they look great, Marianne, wherever you're at. There you are. They're fantastic. And men, right? But you know what? It goes both ways. It does go both ways. I can remember friends that I had lived with years ago, friends from PEI, and Alan and Heather Hale. And they went to see a ball game in Toronto, Sky Dome, when it was still Sky Dome, and it was relatively new. It was a very new building at that point. And as they're watching the game, Alan said, it was a great game. And I don't remember whom was playing or anything like that, but he was talking about just how good of a game it was and everything like that. He says, but Heather couldn't even have told you what the score was because she was so enamored with the open sky in this building and with all the aerial stuff that's going up above and the balloons and the stuff going on in the crowd and, the mascots and everything. That's what she noticed. And, and just thinking, hey, Heather, you're at a game for goodness sakes. But those are 2 examples, and they're kind of funny, and they're really not that serious, are they, in the whole big grand scale of life? But however, there are some things that do go unnoticed at times that really do matter to people. Perhaps an act of kindness goes unnoticed, and that can leave someone feeling a bit unappreciated or bothered that someone else couldn't see something that was so obvious that had been done for them. Or how about this one? And this hadn't happened to me, but I've heard this one. Going to a school reunion, and a classmate has to ask another fellow classmate, who is that person there? Do they have a name? And they can't remember them at all. It's as if they had never, ever met before. And sometimes I wonder, are people that invisible to us? Perhaps they are. And is it really possible to go that unnoticed through the years? And isn't that maybe, to a degree, exactly what the story that Aaron had read for us about Lazarus and a rich man, maybe that's what it's about, that parable that Jesus had told us, or had told to so many years ago. And Lazarus, he was a very poor man, and we're given a bit of an understanding of just how poor he was. And where do we find Lazarus? Well, in the story where we find him, he is located right by a rich man's gate. That's where he was. And why was he there? Well, as we're reading through and as we're listening, was he there to beg? Well, what he certainly was hoping for was to get something in way of possibly money and certainly food. He's looking for something to keep him going, to sustain himself. He's looking for some kind of help. And the picture that we're given of Lazarus is that he was really in a bad spot. And we don't hear him calling out. We don't hear him calling out for food or anything like that. In fact, he doesn't say a thing or a word throughout this entire parable. And we don't find him in a sitting position either. We read of him, and he's lying down at the city gate, and he's got sores all over his body, and he's so weak, and he's so physically in such poor condition as well that he can't even fight off or shoo the dogs away to keep them from licking his open sores. And some commentators or scholars have mentioned that the rich man lived his days without ever noticing Lazarus. But I think that he did notice him. I think he did. And maybe for the scholars, that's a given, that, and in mentioning that he had not noticed Lazarus was maybe within the context of ignoring, that he ignored him over the years. And that's probably true, because he certainly did know who Lazarus was, didn't he? Because in the afterlife, what we're told is that he recognized, he's able to identify Lazarus when he sees him standing beside Father Abraham. And so often this story told by Jesus, the central focus that many will walk away from is where you go when you die. And one of those places in the afterlife depicted in this story is a place of eternal conscious torment. Hades is what it's called, a place reserved for all those who are really bad. And you know what? How we choose to live really does matter. It matters deeply. It matters very much to God, how we will choose to live. And this is really the central focus of the parable, not so much about the hellfire and the brimstone, but more so of how important it is in life to value real treasure and to see it when it's right in front of you, right on your doorstep, right under our noses, near us. And so the story is kind of apocalyptic in nature. I think, at least it fits the form of an apocalypse, and because an apocalypse is supposed to serve as a wake-up call, something that will pull away a veil or a curtain that might be over our eyes, so that we're going to see something that we urgently need to see before it's too late. And in the afterlife, the rich man sees Lazarus, and it's too late. And the story rings with similarity, I think, to another parable that Jesus had told earlier in Luke chapter 12 about another rich man. Remember that story? Called the rich fool. And that was the man who was accumulating wealth. He was accumulating his produce, his goods, and he's having to build bigger barns so that he can fit it all in, so that he can sit on all of this stuff where he can eat and drink and be merry for the rest of his days. And doesn't that sound a little bit like the rich man in the parable today, the rich man with Lazarus? A selfish man who is, he said he's clothed in purple and fine linen, like extreme extravagance. In verse 19, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And in both stories, one of the things that all readers and listeners are left to consider is that of all the wealth that one can accumulate in this lifetime, what is it really worth? Because I can't take it from this place of temporary being to the next. And empire building, is that really the most important thing? Is that going to provide a sense of contentment that will calm an anxious heart? In the first century world in which this parable takes place within, it was really a hard world. And really, hundreds of years that preceded the first century, the world was a very difficult place. One that I can only imagine, but I would never want to experience. And it was cruel, and people were oppressing whomever were weaker for the purpose of acquiring more land and property, so to secure their futures, accumulate enough so if someone bigger than they would come by, they would have a little something to give to them if they ever had to give it up. It was about looking out for number one. And I can't imagine the hard decisions that would have had to have been made. I wonder how many friends and family may have had their backs turned on them because of this kind of world, because of this situation. And yet people have to look after themselves, don't they? Parents and fathers and mothers, who among us wouldn't do anything for our kids, grandkids? And what are we to glean from parables such as these, as told in Luke in Luke 16 here, that each time we see someone in need, that we should just immediately and just without hesitation give in all situations, regardless of circumstances. And for goodness sake, if you were here last Sunday, this is the second Sunday in a row now where our readings have had to do with money and giving. Hey, we get it already. And I do think that our congregation is particularly generous in giving of their resources too, whether it's, you see it through things such as Angels Anonymous and other projects, and even just the general giving of that comes around here. This is a generous place, so why the lecture again on giving and money? Well, what we can say is this, is that money and possessions were certainly an issue in the first century. They were definitely that. And it was certainly a problem or an issue too in the 8th century world with the prophet Amos. And honestly, in our world too, wealth is still a very large issue. And in the ancient world, the issue or the problem was not wealth in and of itself, just like today, but It was in the people's determination to accumulate wealth rather than to use it and share it to alleviate the needs that others may have, those in a real bad state. And the poor were everywhere, even sitting at the very gates of wealthy citizens, hoping for table scraps, anything to survive, looking for mercy, but rarely finding it. And God has his eye on the poor. He has his eye on the broken in spirit and calls his people to fall in line with his concern for those people. It matters. It matters to God deeply that people will care for one another. Amos chapter 6, verse 1, that Aaron had read, "Woe to those who are at ease in Zion, and to those who feel secure on the mountain of Samaria. Woe to those who lie on beds of ivory and stretch themselves out on their couches and eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall, and who are not grieved over the ruin of Israel," or over the ruin of Joseph. And Amos is a book of judgment. And God is angry. And contrary to what one might think, God's anger is not opposite of God's love. Rather, God's judgment is an expression of his love. Because God loves people. And when one person or people cause others to suffer, that doesn't please God. This angers God. And so we can say that God's anger is a sign of God's love for those who are oppressed. And Amos, and when reading through Amos, he's painting a picture of a feast that is taking place, a picture of a people who claim to belong to God, who claim to belong to the Lord, and who trust the Lord to protect them and keep them at ease and keep them secure, but who behave in such a very different and decidedly ungodly manner. And he uses imagery that may be actual extravagance, ivory beds and expensive foods, and we have this picture of extreme extravagance that is before us here. And Amos takes aim at those in power in Jerusalem and in power in Samaria, those who can tax the poor of the land, and worse, use the tax proceeds not only for the welfare of the people, but more so for their own luxury, more so for filling their own pockets. And they're not grieved. They are not grieved by the ruin of Joseph. They are not grieved for those who suffer in Israel. And the point of the prophet Amos is that God's people, specifically those invested with power, instead of using the power and authority given to them and to tend to the welfare of people, they used it for their own privilege, to their own welfare. And as in all scriptures, such as Amos and such as Luke, there is always something that God has for us to consider through it all. And Amos compels us to take a good long look at ourselves. How much does the welfare of another mean to us? And are we being faithful with what God has given to us? And perhaps Paul's statement in 1 Timothy 6, perhaps it hits the very heart of it all when he says, "Godliness with contentment is great gain." And yes, Paul, he reminds us that, wealth is, watch out for wealth. But long before he even makes this statement, he has a whole lot of other things in mind too that precede the issue of wealth and so forth. Things that are desires and distractions that are unbecoming. And any object of desire that overshadows a primary allegiance to God, whatever it could be, it imperils the faithfulness that sustains our sharing the love of Jesus with others. And so the thing we're asked to consider for ourselves is, what is our distraction? Can we identify it? Or would we be more like those 5 brothers in Luke chapter 16, who have a world of opportunity to live within the mission and life of Jesus, but cannot see what it is that really matters most to God in this life, even when it's right before them? I remember a story of a boy who went to Disneyland. It's Florida. And he couldn't wait. He had this day there or a time there, and he couldn't wait to get back home and go back to school and to share with his classmates during the show and tell period all that he had experienced at Disney World. And he makes it back home, and he's in school, and he's just eagerly waiting because remember show and tell. He had more to tell than he did show, and he just couldn't wait. And it was near the end of the day, and finally it arrived, and he stands up, and I get to share. I get to tell. And he says, "I went to Disneyland or Disney World, and this was my experience? Well, first I arrived at the park, and the parking lot was huge. It was huge. And there was I got to ride this little cart that was kind of like a train because it had a bunch of little carts in behind it that I didn't even have to walk to the gates. It took me right to the gates. And it was a long ride because it was a big parking lot. And it took me to the gates, and there were a lot of gates. But I went through the gates, and I went to buy my ticket, and I bought my ticket, and then I had to go to the turnstiles, the little whatever, little spindly thing, right? And he says, and when I got there's a lot of those too. And I went through those turnstiles, and then there was another train, and I got on that train. And it was more like a real train. And this train went around the entire park, and sometimes the rails were way off the ground. We were high up there riding around the park, and I got to see the animals. I got to see Tomorrowland from the sky there. I got to see so much. I think I saw everything from that train. And then he stopped talking. He was quiet for a while. He said, I loved the train. And then his classmates, they're waiting for more because a lot of them were dreaming for one day. That one day they would be able to get to that same place, that place that is regarded as the happiest place on earth, is what it's described as. And one classmate says, well, come on, you're holding back here. What about the rides? What did you think? What was the scariest ride? What was the funnest ride? Funnest isn't a word, but we're using it here. We're talking about kids after all. And did you see Mickey? A parade. How about the street shows? The street shows are pretty interesting. What was it all like? This little guy looks and he kind of furrows his brow. He's I don't know. I liked the train so much that I never got off. I just rode it all day, and I went home at the end of the day when the park was closed. One of the classmates says, you've never got off the train for the entire day? No. Was I supposed to? You know what? Poor kid, he was right there, so close to it all, watching from the outside, yet he had never walked through the gates into the Magic Kingdom, right? Happiest place on earth. And I think the parallel that's there for me is that I don't merely want to believe that opportunities are to really live in God's kingdom are out there. I don't want to just believe that, but I want to experience that. For I have made the good confession that Paul speaks of. We've made the good confession, which, according to Paul, is a vow of faith, that an unwavering fidelity that demonstrates the sort of character that does not put these mundane anxieties of life or the pursuit of them, it doesn't get it in the way from us from pursuing what is right, for pursuing godliness and faith and love and endurance and gentleness. It's being single-minded and secure in the knowledge that he is the sovereign King of Kings and he's the Lord of Lords, that who alone is immortal and dwells in unapproachable light. And how might I be used by God today in this world? How might I get there? Moving within the kingdom. Moving within the kingdom is this. It's about experiencing it and sharing it with others. The healthy and the sick, with the poor and the rich, the happy and the sad, the countryman and the foreigner, those who are found and those who are lost. And we are to have a heart for the brokenhearted, the broken in spirit. We are to share God's love with them, to give it away to as many as possible. And how do I begin? Pray. It all starts with a prayer. God, teach me what it means to love one another as you have loved me. Show me what I can do to love one another. I don't want to miss out as the rich man had, and I don't want to be blind to what matters to you as the 5 brothers were. I want to see what you will do in and through me. I don't want to look back on life on what I had missed or on what I had never done. I want to move in line with you in the here and now, because it's not too late. I can begin now. There's still time. It's about being a blessing. Make me a blessing. Let's sing together that our concluding song, Make Me a Blessing.